Let the word go
The
forth.
challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a pioneering program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
That looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of shared values.
With something real.
60 years later, we examine our divisions, our connections, our shared pains and successes in a new program called Challenge 2.0. Imagine a factory opens in your community, possibly your own neighborhood. Months later, local residents, some your neighbors, began developing illnesses the doctors said were caused by toxic waste from the factory. Laws were passed, forcing the factory to stop releasing that waste. But the company then sued to stop those laws, to invalidate them, and then demanded money from the city for passing the laws in the first place. Local courts didn't get to decide that lawsuit. It was settled by outside arbitrators, who also act as attorneys occasionally for other polluting companies. This practice is the subject of our next edition of Challenge 2.0, When Health Takes a Backseat to Wealth. If our introduction caught your sense of curiosity, we have with us the two journalists who wrote this fascinating and disturbing article, and they are namely Katie Surma and Nick Kuznets. Both are journalists for Inside Climate News. Katie and Nick, thank you so much for joining us in this program.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, you recently wrote the article, How to Buy a Piece of a Lawsuit and Impoverish a Country. And I'm curious, what inspired you or troubled you to begin to do the research and to write this article?
Yeah, well, so this was part of a series that Nick and I did on a system called Investor State Dispute Settlement. And it's a system that's written into thousands of investment treaties and contracts, and it gives corporations that are foreign investors special rights. They're very formidable rights, and corporations can enforce them before panels of arbitrators. And the Greenland case was one such case, and it illustrated some attributes of the system that are problematic. One of which is, this mining company filed an ISDS case against Greenland when Greenland ratcheted up protections on uranium mining. And it did that because there was an outcry from citizens about radioactivity and those sorts of consequences from mining. And so this company is seeking, I think, $11.5 billion from Greenland, and that's like 6 times the nation's annual spending. So we wanted to explore that and explore who might be profiting off of this lawsuit. And it turns out it is a financial firm, Wall Street firm, that may be doing so.
And so how does that work? The company itself doesn't come up with the money to fund the lawsuit. It gets that money from other sources?
Yeah, that's right. In some cases, a company or in kind of more conventional law can be like an individual plaintiff. You won't have the money to bring a claim, or perhaps will have the money but not want to spend it. And we found that latter one to be the case a lot in this system. We were talking about where these are generally corporate parties bringing claims. And in some cases, like in this case by a mining company operating in Greenland, it wasn't so much that they had no money, but rather that they'd rather spend their money on other things, reserve the cash. And so they can turn to what's really a kind of mini sector within the larger finance sector of firms that they finance lawsuits, in this case, these arbitration claims as well. And in exchange for paying all the costs and the fees, they get a cut of any winnings. And as we discovered, it's an incredibly profitable business for some firms.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, and it's been a couple days since I read over your article, but it seems to me that there was something, and I may have the term wrong, that's reflected in this type of case called either double or triple hatting. Number one, did I get the term right? And number two, could you explain exactly what the significance of that is?
Yeah, so double hatting is a term that's descriptive of something that happens in ISDS, which is that the arbitrators that oversee these cases also act as legal counsel in other cases. So it would be like a US judge representing the, companies or individuals who come before it when or come before him or her in cases that he or she is a judge on. Those same lawyers also sometimes act as expert witnesses in cases. So triple hatting, if you will. And this has been a subject of criticism of ISDS, of this arbitration industry. It's very lucrative for lawyers, for arbitrators, and for expert witnesses. And, critics say it's rife with conflicts of interest.
Hmm.
Uh, we've spoken to some arbitrators who have said, oh, it's actually it's a superpower for us that we understand these different facets by acting in different roles.
You're asking them essentially to be able to put aside any sort of allegiance or sympathy they might have based on their other roles. It sort of strikes me that it would be like, just to pull an example out of baseball, for let's say the Yankees and the Red Sox, and I won't ask your allegiance there, but let's say it's a coach for the Red Sox who doesn't have to work for the Red Sox at a given time to serve as an umpire in a game between the two. It just seems like if I were a Yankee fan, I would object to that.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's part of a broader sort of lack of institutional checks or transparency across the ISDS
Hmm.
system. These cases are typically held behind closed doors. Sometimes the pleadings in the case aren't public. Sometimes the case itself isn't even public. We had to go to great lengths to find information about all these various aspects of the case, including whether cases are funded by third-party funders
Hmm.
in the Greenland Minerals case, to know who's profiting off of it and who could be steering the litigation. And, in this particular funder of the Greenland case, um, Nick, correct me if I'm wrong, one of its biggest investors is a unnamed sovereign wealth fund, which again introduces this geopolitical element. Who is driving these cases because they're enormous awards and governments, taxpayers are paying them.
Well, I think maybe it's just worth zooming out for a second. You asked about how we got to this story. I mean, I think more broadly, this series of stories we wrote about this investor state dispute settlement system. So this system it's created by thousands of treaties between countries and
Hmm.
sometimes trade agreements like NAFTA, the North America Free Trade Agreement, right? And so these agreements basically just give investors rights to sue governments essentially if if the governments take actions that affect the profitability of those investments.
Hmm.
And part of what raised it to our attention, the number of claims has been rising over the last decade in general, but part of um, what made Katie and I want to focus on it was that increasingly there's concerns that the system might be acting like a brake on climate action. Um, so the fossil fuel and mining sectors have used the system more than any other. Um, and within that, there are cases now where governments are starting to act to try to phase out fossil fuels.
Hmm.
For example, in Italy, there was opposition to offshore drilling, and there was a bit of back and forth, and eventually the country put in place a ban on offshore drilling. But then it got hit with a claim by a British oil company that had rights to explore, and the company ended up winning that case, and Italy had to pay about $200 million. So there are other cases where coal mining companies are bringing claims against governments for policies to phase out coal burning power plants, for example.
Hmm.
And so there's increasing concerns that either governments will slow walk their own attempts to phase out fossil fuels, or if they don't, that they'll be punished for it and have to pay out um, billions of dollars potentially to fossil fuel firms. So then within that, Katie and I learned about the role that these financial firms are playing in funding the cases and potentially leading to more claims than there might otherwise be.
Mhm. You mentioned something that was very interesting, and that is that you referred to the number of cases increasing. Tell me a little bit more about that. Are we seeing an increase? Are the awards increasing? Are more investors getting into the action, so to speak?
I mean, first, it's worth noting that no one actually knows how many claims exactly are being
Hmm.
brought. Um, we call it a system, but it's like a number of different systems, and claims can be brought through these treaties, trade agreements. They can also be brought, as Katie mentioned, through contracts. And each of these can have different rules. And while many claims are made public through the World Bank has a system that oversees these, the UN has one. There can also be claims that never become public.
Hmm.
That said, the publicly known claims did start to rise in the 2010s in particular. Well, were rising throughout the 2000s and really climbing in the 2010s. Um, and at the same time, that coincided with a rise in third-party financing of claims. And so that partly gave rise to this fact, well, how much of this is just happening at the same time or is one driving the other?
Hmm. Some of the companies, from reading your article that won financial awards, I believe there was a reference that even though they did prevail, there was evidence that they'd committed either human rights violations or had violated other laws on the books. Why is that possible?
That's a great question. And it speaks to really, I think, the fragmentation of legal systems
Mhm.
and what, governments have just or who governments have decided to give rights to, what kind of rights, and how they can be enforced. One of the first stories that Nick and I did was a case filed against Ecuador by an oil company called Perenco. And there was a vast amount of evidence in the record about the environmental destruction this company had left behind. Nonetheless, it won Nick, was it over
It
a
was
hundred
about 400
million?
million eventually. Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
award. And people living in this area, I traveled there and met with them. They had not heard of this system. They questioned why this company was able to vindicate its rights while theirs were violated and they had
Hmm.
no recourse. Um, another case in Ecuador was famous. A mining company had hired paramilitary forces and fired on local communities that were protesting the mining operations. It that you throw a dart at a map and you can find cases like this.
Hmm.
It's part of a broader problem of multinational companies and accountability for environmental or human rights violations. Those things don't matter in investor state dispute settlement. The arbitrators kind of look at the four corners of the investment agreement or the contract and ask, were the company's rights violated? And that's it.
It's a big profit center for them too, is it not?
One of our sources put it, everyone involved in the system sort of has their snouts in the trough.
Mm.
And so people, we had sources that were very reluctant to go on the record to talk about things they told us on background, because it affects their bottom line.
It's, the lack of rule of law
Mhm.
in many countries that gives rise to people like Katie was talking about not being able to have any kind of recourse when their lands are polluted is also part of what gave rise to the system. I mean, the main argument for these protections is that they help draw foreign investment and that they would do that because a company from, say, the United States or Europe might be reluctant to go into a country that is politically volatile, does not have strong rule of law, the courts are not independent. The same system that can fail to give um, any kind of recourse or rights to citizens in an area is the same one that gives rise to these protections.
It seems that what we might term third world nations seem to have a fairly high proportion and profile in these cases. Number one, is that correct? And would it be fair to say that this could be seen as representing sort of a white collar neocolonialism?
The majority of claims are brought by companies from North America and Europe and
Hmm.
against governments in Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia.
The creators of the system had no idea what exactly it would become. The first investment treaties with ISDS happened, I think, in 1969 was the first one. And it wasn't until the 90s when cases under NAFTA started exploding and the legal industry said, hey, there are these incredible rights buried in these treaties.
Hmm.
And started using them, and the way the arbitrators were interpreting rights, the right to fair and equitable treatment, they started to get broader and broader. So going from like expropriations or seizure of
Hmm.
assets to this concept of regulatory taking, that a restriction on a toxic chemical affected a company's bottom line to such an extent that it was an expropriation, an indirect expropriation. So it has evolved into this monster that now is, again, as Nick said, it's it's 1,000 different little systems, different agreements, and so it's difficult to, uh, reform or get rid of.
Now, an international trade agreement is different than what we'd be seeing perhaps within the United States. But have you seen other cases, either directly or at least implicitly, resemble these filed against cities, counties, or states?
Sometimes a city, county, or state action can trigger an ISDS suit.
Hmm.
I believe there were some under NAFTA that took place, like a Mexican state did something. Um, but it
Hmm.
is, the government, the national government, that is always the defendant, I believe.
Are there any attempts to reform or even eradicate it?
Yeah, there are. As particularly as European countries were starting to face these claims, and as Kate and I wrote about, the United States was facing a huge claim of $15 billion from a Canadian pipeline company. Um,
Hmm.
there was growing opposition, in the developed, wealthy world, which is really the countries that put the system in place,
Yeah.
to either reform or dismantle. So many European countries have been pulling out of that energy treaty. But I mean, this is something that Katie and I wrote about. This is sort of layered on top of a longer opposition from particularly several countries in South America, uh,
Hmm.
some in Africa, um, that have been trying to. So there are countries that have started to withdraw from the system. And you do this by pulling out of all these treaties, which you can do unilaterally. But the problem is that the treaties have what are called sunset clauses, which give investors sometimes 10, 15, 20 years to bring claims as long as it's for an investment that was made before the withdrawal happened. Um,
Hmm.
so there are countries that have been withdrawing. The Trump administration actually, when they replaced the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, with a new agreement, they they got rid of ISDS between the US and Canada. They
Hmm.
kept in a somewhat more limited form for US investors in Mexico.
Hmm.
Um, but the Trump administration actually was ready to do away with it at all because they saw it kind of as a breach of sovereignty. Um, Biden, as president, had promised not to include it in any new efforts, and right now there's sort of talk of whether there's some kind of limited um, some kind of efforts to limit it between Colombia and the US. So all to say, there
Hmm.
are these efforts to either limit it, address it, or in some cases just withdraw from the system altogether.
So viewers might wonder, that's operating on a nation-to-nation basis. What if they find this something that's very concerning? What can individuals possibly do that might give them some leverage on the process?
I mean, these treaties are ultimately in the hands of governments, like you said.
Hmm.
So it's governments that have to unwind them. So it would be calling your representative, your senator, federal, and telling them that this is of concern to you. There's reform processes ongoing as well at the United Nations and at the World Bank, but a lot of our sources say those are sort of putting a band-aid on a, breach in a dam, that it's not really changing anything. So it would be that political process, and that's also why it's so hard to unwind it.
What of the issue of you have these investor groups that are basically helping support this? Might there be some leverage there where people could find out who's funding them and attempt to apply some leverage there? What are some examples of some of the groups that are funding these?
So you're referring to the third-party funders.
Right, right.
So we found that very few third-party funders are actually public.
Hmm.
Um, but there are a few that are. And you can look up, who their biggest investors are. And in the one that we wrote about for Greenland Minerals, BlackRock was invested. There was a teacher's retirement fund, I believe, in Texas, Nick. Is that
Hmm.
right? So, if people are concerned if their pension fund is invested in one of these, they can, do a little due diligence on that.
You've both done wonderful work at ground level on this, but is this an element of a larger problem that we're facing? What are your views on that, and what would your suggestions be?
Broadly speaking, the investor state dispute settlement system is part of how corporations and, particularly corporations from wealthy countries have worked to shape legal systems, in this case, international law, in their
Hmm.
favor. Katie was talking before about the juxtaposition of rights and law. If a company wins an ISDS claim against a government, they're able to go enforce that around the world. And there's cases that we wrote it like in Ecuador,
Hmm.
they went to freeze bank accounts of Ecuador and Luxembourg. But if there's, a human rights case against a government, there's often no kind of enforcement mechanism with teeth, that can
Hmm.
actually force an outcome for the people bringing those claims. So in that sense, I mean, it's just part of this broader system of corporate power, really.
Legal systems are expensive. The amount of financing that it takes to bring a case and keep it going, um, you know, it's no coincidence that third-party funders are rushing into ISDS. It's lucrative, it's enforceable. You don't see third-party funders backing a lot of human rights cases.
Hmm.
You know, the old adage of in journalism of kind of follow the money. I think
Right.
that speaks volumes about, you know, why the world works the way it does.
One question I always like to offer up in conversations like these, is there anything we haven't covered that you would like to mention, or any points that you'd like to make that we have not yet covered?
Well, I mean, one big one about ISDS is to remember who is footing the bills for the awards, and it's taxpayers. So the same people that are affected, local communities that are affected by these foreign investors, their land is polluted or their rights are violated in some way, are the same people ultimately paying these multi-hundred billion or 100 million to billion-dollar awards to the same companies. I think that that's a really important point. And one of our sources put it pretty well when he said, it's a wealth extraction mechanism from
Mm.
these public coffers to corporations.
A couple of words about the group you work with, Inside Climate News. Tell us a little bit about that.
We're a nonprofit news organization focused on climate change, and we cover, climate and environment from an accountability public interest lens. And we have a kind of a distributed newsroom around the country and some colleagues who are outside the country as well. We publish on our website, but we also partner with, larger outlets. For example, the Honduras story that we wrote in this series was published by Wired, and some of the other stories were republished by other partners. So, yeah, we have a wider reach that way.
Well, for our viewers, we're going to be supering the website for Inside Climate News up on the screen, but I thank you both very, very much for taking your time. I know you're continuing to investigate ongoing stories and would definitely recommend people check out your website. And thank you for your good work, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
If you've enjoyed this program, found the conversations informative, interesting, and thought-provoking, and the visions of people from different backgrounds, faiths, or wisdom traditions inspiring, people who can disagree without being disagreeable and respect the essential human dignity of all, perhaps consider supporting our organization with a contribution. Your donation will not only support this program, but also the broader work of our nonprofit charitable organization, Paths to Understanding. Thank you.